Welcome everybody to this month's SAMOCAN. SAMOCAN stands for Santa Monica Climate Action Network. It's a project of Climate Action Santa Monica. We have a great program lined up for today with our guest, Denny Zane. At CHASM, we try to understand the ever-evolving global issues surrounding climate first, and then bring that knowledge home to shape what we can do here for the greatest impact. Today, Denny Zane, the creator of Move LA, will be presenting and discussing how we in the Southern California region can create a coalition and regional voter initiative for a measure that, if approved by a simple majority of voters, will raise money to invest in strategies to end air pollution, dramatically reduce climate pollution, and enhance zero-emission regional transit mobility. So we're going to proceed with the presentation now. And after that, we'll take questions from the chat and also answer a few from CHASM members submitted beforehand. But before I hand it over to Denny, I'd like to provide a little more background on Denny Zane. Denny Zane grew up in the Inland Empire town of Colton. He's the son of a steelworker and welder and a nurse. He graduated from Colton High School as a valedictorian of the class of 1965 and moved to Los Angeles to attend Occidental College on a Kennedy-era National Defense Fund scholarship. He graduated from Occidental with the class of 1969, a philosophy major and effective student anti-war organizer. In 1979, Zane served as a campaign manager of the successful voter-approved rent control measure in Santa Monica. And in 1981, he was elected for the first time to the Santa Monica City Council, where he served 3 terms, including a 2-year term as mayor. Over the next 12 years, Zane formulated much of Santa Monica's successful affordable housing policies and programs, including novel zoning policies to enable multifamily housing and mixed-use developments on commercial boulevards, long before such policies were implemented in other communities. And in 1986, he formulated the plan to create the 3rd Street Promenade, a strategy that emphasized the creation of a 3-block outdoor dining district unique in Southern California. In the early 1990s, Zane served as the executive director of the Coalition for Clean Air, developing legislation with then Assembly member Antonio Villaraigosa to create the Carl Moyer program, still the state's most significant effort to fund clean alternatives to diesel fuel trucks. And in 2007, he convened labor, environmental, and business leaders to create a coalition which came to be known as Move LA, to champion 2 sales tax ballot measures in LA County to fund a massive transit expansion. Measure R in 2008 and Measure M in 2016 each received over 2/3 of voter support, and together will generate $2.5 billion this year and an expected $120 billion over the next 40 years, or over 40 years. And shortly thereafter, Zane proposed another ballot measure in LA County to Supervisor Ridley Thomas to raise over $600 million a year to fund services for homeless persons. Measure H was also approved by voters, receiving more than 2/3 vote on March 4th, 2017. In 2019, in collaboration with Unite Here Local 11, that's a hotel workers union, convened social justice and tenant advocates and labor leaders in the city of LA to formulate a voter initiative to raise hundreds of millions of dollars by taxing high-value real estate transactions to fund prevention and resolution of homelessness and to build affordable housing for low-income households. On November 8th, 2022, LA voters approved Measure ULA, and this year it will likely generate about $400 million. Thus far, ballot measures initiated by Denny Zane are generating over $3.5 billion per year for transit and affordable housing and homeless prevention. And Denny is now working on a regional Southern California voter initiative for November 2026 to raise over $90 billion over 30 years for investments in climate and clean air and regional transit. So with that, I welcome you, Denny Zane, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I see my friend Catherine King there. Hey, Catherine. So I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint presentation, but I have to apologize initially. This is not the customary pretty pictures in a PowerPoint. It's more of like my talking points, my argument. It's more verbal, and I think you'll still get a lot out of it, but it makes the case, and it's also it's in formation because I'm in the early part of this effort, and it'll get better as we go along. But let me go to it right now. Let's see. All right. You can all see that, right? All right, so this is a summary page of what you were just hearing about, these ballot measures. In mostly Los Angeles County, but also in Los Angeles. People in Santa Monica who know me from my renters' rights work, etc., mostly don't know about this stuff. Catherine, I don't know if you knew about much of this stuff, but this has been my work life for the last 15 years.
I'm very aware of it. Yeah.
Okay. So, and what you can see is we learned to use the ballot box to raise a boatload of money for important public purposes like expanding transit in Los Angeles County and providing services and affordable housing to help end homelessness in our community. Altogether, our measures are generating about 3.5 billion per year, and will do so in perpetuity, which means for a long time. And it'll enable, I think, LA County to continuously modernize its transit system and its affordable housing program. Now, every ballot measure has to be in some jurisdiction. So we've worked mostly in cities and counties where there is a constitutional authority to have ballot measures. But if you want to work a ballot measure on clean air and climate change, you have to find the appropriate district. Now, in 2022, there was a ballot measure, Proposition 30, on the ballot statewide. That was a tax on people with incomes of $2 million a year. And it would have raised $100 billion over 20 years to invest in zero-emission transportation. Governor Newsom opposed it. You may remember hearing him call it the lift grift. And that was really nonsense because it was fashioned by, a half a dozen or so environmental advocates, including myself. I was the convener. So the governor, I think, blew a chance for all of us to have a head start on fighting climate change. But now we're going back to the South Coast Air District, and this is a map of that district. This is the agency which has responsibility for trying to clean our air, but it has limited authority. What you see here is, can you see my cursor on the map? Does it show there?
Yeah, it's very small.
All right, so that's Los Angeles County right there. Then down in green is Orange County. Over to the right, well, it's not all Orange County, but it's mostly Orange County. And then over to the right is Riverside and San Bernardino counties. These are the counties in the South Coast Air District, they have the most air pollution of any area in California, in the United States. This is the smog capital. And this agency, the South Coast Air District, has had responsibility for a number of years to try to reduce our air pollution. But its authority really only goes to stationary sources like refineries, power plants, manufacturing, etc. So it has always had to rely upon the state if it is going to have strategies for reducing emissions from cars and trucks and mobile sources. It's going to have to be very creative. And mostly that means figuring out how to find money to create incentives and make investments. But this is where half of California lives. So it's a powerful area. If you are able to succeed in reducing emissions here to make the air clean and to help climate health, it would have a dramatic effect upon the nation as a whole by making those technologies not only more advanced, but more affordable. It's the economies of scale that this region would create would likely make the cleanest available technologies affordable throughout the nation and perhaps throughout the world. That is one of the reasons why this area and this measure is so important, because of its potential for global impact. You all know that air pollution risks the health of many residents. What you may not know is that within that air pollution, diesel emissions are by far the worst. The unregulated part of diesel emissions, the air toxins and carcinogens, are the worst part of that. And they're not even the part that's regulated. You might have heard of NOx and black carbon particulate matter is being regulated, but it's really the toxins and the carcinogens that we're trying to get rid of. And these other, like NOx, is really the most useful way of organizing the regulation. That was an interesting and so
just to let people know, keep your microphones muted. Speaking.
So the federal government and the Clean Air Act creates deadlines for states about meeting its air quality targets, and they can withhold federal transportation money if areas don't succeed in meeting their targets. And for the first time, EPA in the last 2 years has threatened Southern California with loss of federal transportation money if we don't succeed. We also know that climate change is worsening. As I said earlier, South Coast lacks the authority or the resources to meet these federal standards. And so we are truly at risk of having those sanctions, as well as having air pollution and climate change continue to burden us. The State Air Resources Board also lacks funding to go to the scale we need. So if we're going to do this, we're going to have to figure out how to do it ourselves. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is a ballot measure. So anyway, so we're looking at a regional voter initiative that could raise $100 billion. Now, let me back up for a minute, because it used to be, we thought that ballot measures that raise taxes all had to be 2/3 vote. We thought that Prop 13 and Prop 218, approved by statewide voters in California, had forced us to always get 2/3 vote. But in 2018, that changed. It changed because of a little measure in the city called Upland, California, a marijuana tax, actually. And after it was all shaken through, it turned out that the California courts ruled that voter initiatives, measures that go to the ballot, not by local government decision, but by signature drive, do not need 2/3. They only need a majority vote. And that is how we passed Measure ULA in Los Angeles, as well as GS in Santa Monica, by using the voter initiative. And of course, that's what we would want to do in the Air District as well. But what would we want the Air District to do with such money? Well, here's our idea. First of all, you look at the emissions inventory. And if you're looking at NOx emissions, NOx is the air pollutant that is most directly regulated by federal law. As I told you, it's not the worst of it. It's just the most useful for regulation purposes. But if you reduce NOx emissions, you will also be reducing multiple other pollutants as well. And if you look at this inventory chart, you see that about 85% of our NOx emissions, our air that causes the ozone, is generated by transportation sources. About 2/3 of that is diesel-powered vehicles. Diesel is really our culprit for air pollution. And it turns out also a big culprit for climate change. Again, looking at the emissions inventory, always look at the inventory. If you look at this, this is California's emissions inventory for greenhouse gases. And you can see down here, the transportation is 39%, and electricity up here is about 16%. Together, about 55% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So transportation is the big source for both air pollution, but also for greenhouse gases. And if you add electricity generation, then you really are going after the biggest sources of both air pollution and greenhouse gases. So we want to have a priority objective that goes 100% zero emission transportation and 100% renewable power. Now, we all know, I guess, to some extent, that the state is kind of underway with these things. The electric vehicle program started in California with legislation in 1990 and really got underway about 2006 when it really started to take off. But, you know, I think most of the time we have all thought it unlikely that it was going to become competitive in the marketplace with gasoline or diesel. It was, you know, charging took too long, the range was too short, the batteries were too heavy, lots of reasons why for many years people thought it unlikely that electric vehicle or zero emission transportation was going to become the dominant part, that the technology just wasn't likely to be there. However, I think we're about to understand that that's changed. In addition, California has a policy of achieving 100% renewable power by 2045. Mostly that's solar and wind generation in California, offshore mostly, or not yet offshore, but will be mostly offshore. And that we're seeing there emerging opportunities. But to effectively fight climate change, we must also reduce something called short-lived climate pollutants. Most people think that climate change is about carbon dioxide, and it certainly is. Carbon dioxide is the most abundant climate-forcing gas, but it's not the most powerful. These 4 gases are more powerful than carbon dioxide. And they also decay in the atmosphere much more quickly. whereas carbon dioxide might take 150, 200 years to decay in the atmosphere. Methane in less than 20 years will decay. And these other pollutants also, in a relatively short period of time, they decay. They are more powerful, but they decay more quickly. And so what it means is if we had a smart strategy to reduce emissions of these gases, we can have a big impact on climate in a short period of time, whereas carbon dioxide is the long run. So we have to do both. Oh, look at this. Two of these, ozone and black carbon, are also primarily from diesel sources. It is a convergence of objectives between our air pollution and our climate objectives that if we are effective in getting rid of diesel sources, not only do we get rid of those carcinogens and those toxic air contaminants I mentioned, ozone is a byproduct of NOx. If we get rid of NOx, we start to get rid of most of the ozone. And black carbon is a big chunk of that is particulate matter, also diesel sources. So we begin to see our strategy. Methane will take, I think, a strategy of its own worth talking about. But the key point is to understand is our technologies in these transportation sources have really developed much more quickly. And we're only really beginning to appreciate how successful the technology development has been in multiple arenas. Light duty vehicles, medium duty and heavy duty vehicles and equipment, battery powered or hydrogen fuel cell powered, are becoming increasingly competitive with their fossil fueled alternatives. Now the big question isn't, are we going to have the technology? The big question becomes, how do we deploy it on an accelerated basis? How do we get it out there in the marketplace being used, displacing gasoline and diesel quickly? Because if we do, we can really begin to have a very positive impact on the progress of climate change, especially if we also are able to eliminate short-lived climate pollutants. So that's very, very exciting. And I think only really beginning to dawn on the regulatory community. So often, I think in this arena, we have been, there are so many different arenas that are productive to pursue. But if we go back to really look at where the main sources of the emissions are in the transportation and power sectors, we can see that we have really made enormous progress on the technologies. What we need is a strategy for accelerated deployment. And that brings us to the priority for our proposed ballot measure. In order for these technologies to be deployed on an accelerated basis, we need infrastructure. We need EV charging infrastructure. We need electrolytic hydrogen production and distribution. And both of those need a great deal more of renewable power. Right now, we have problems of curtailment with our existing electricity use. But if we're going to use more electricity to charge our electric vehicles or to run electrolytic hydrogen production, we are going to need more and more renewable power. And that becomes the big three for where one would want to target our investments. Renewable power, EV charging, especially public charging, and electrolytic hydrogen. Now, electrolytic hydrogen is in order to enable fuel cells to operate, for example, long-haul trucks and trains and ships. Fuel cells, hydrogen-powered fuel cells are the most advanced technology for dealing with what we call hard to electrify sectors. The sectors that where the battery is too heavy or the charging, the range is too short and the charging is too long. Things like long-haul trucking won't make a shift there unless it can operate close to what they're operating at now, and fuel cells can do that. But we must remember also to invest in reducing short-lived climate pollutants, especially methane. Yes, we should provide incentives for the buyers and users of the zero-emission vehicles and equipment, but our priority really has shifted. It has shifted. The incentives are needed more for lower income people in disadvantaged communities, but the larger share of our investment should be in those three areas of infrastructure. We want to suggest also that this measure provide funds to transform our 5-county Metrolink system into a zero-emission regional express system, and where at least one corridor would be compatible with the high-speed rail system that is heading our way from two directions, actually. Major investments in infrastructure and in transit like that will create tens of thousands of union jobs. This turns out to be a strategically vital, because every campaign needs a revenue source to run, to do the campaigning. The building trades, who have long been resistant to change in these areas, because people who work in refineries and work on the fossil fuel industries are often in the building trades, and it's taken a while for them to be convinced that the zero emission options of the future are also good job options for them. But they are now convinced, and the building trades leadership is starting to lead the way on things like electrolytic hydrogen in particular. They will be a key part of funding this campaign. In fact, the coalition that will fund this campaign will be very much like the coalition we created for Measure R and Measure M, because it is really all about infrastructure investments. So this is, again, going back over what we did before, why we think winning is possible. We've won 4 times. We think we can win again. Prop 30 was a product of our efforts as well. It did not pass, but I'm bringing these here again to show you, because I want to remind you that we are experienced at this ballot measure stuff, and even on a statewide level. And while we didn't win this one, it was a major effort to get it on the ballot. The polling that we did on a similar measure in 2020 showed over 60% support for a 0.5-cent sales tax. A 0.5-cent sales tax is not the only option, but it's a good option to use for calculating potential revenue. A 0.5-cent sales tax would generate about $90 billion over 30 years throughout this region. So our $90 billion or $100 billion target is actually a reasonable target for any such measure. So this is what we have to do. We have to convene the coalition partners, negotiate objectives, identify other partners. We have to get legislation done next year to authorize a measure in the South Coast Air District. We have to get some early polling done, especially if we're going to use other taxes besides sales taxes. There's a sales tax on the ballot in LA County now, this November, for affordable housing. We hope it passes. If it does, we are going to want to look at other tax options, probably parcel taxes, perhaps container fees in the ports as well. But this coalition looks a lot like the same coalition that we convened to win Measure R and Measure M. We know a lot of these leaders. Many of these people are on my board. We have 6 major labor unions and 4 engineering and construction management companies on our board, as well as a number of environmental advocates. So we think we can pull together this coalition and we can pass this measure. But the key leave behind, I think, for you all is to understand that for 2 decades, we have been wondering and wandering about whether or not the technologies that we needed in transportation and in power generation were going to actually emerge and be competitive. And now we know we're there. They'll get better. As you invest in them, as the marketplace grows for them, competition will drive them to perform better, and they'll become less expensive. Economies of scale will bring down their cost. And if we are able to succeed on the scale we think we can here in Southern California, those technologies will become an opportunity for other parts of our country, indeed other parts of the world, where high-performing technologies at a lower cost can become available in other communities around the world. We in Southern California, because of our scale, because of our history of innovation on air pollution rather, we can be the trigger for success in winning climate health back to our planet. And that's all I got to say.
Well, great, Denny. That was a very informative presentation, and that's sounds like a transformative measure that you got in the works there.
That's it. You're totally right.
Yeah, this is what we need more of. It is some time off in the future before we're going to actually be taking actions as individuals, I believe, from what you outlined. It's got to go through a number of steps to get it to that point. But I do want to open it up to questions now. And if you want to put the questions in the chat, that would be ideal. But, you know, I think we have a small enough group. We could also just raise hands, although I cannot see everybody. And well,
Shall I leave this up or take it down?
Yeah, I think to help us watch the questions and the hands go up, it'd be better to take it down, then I can see everybody's response on screen. But if I didn't already mention it, Denny, the Climate Corps members are going to be doing advocacy activities. That's part of their training. And they may have questions related to that your sage advice could inform them on some tips on how to go about promoting causes and advocacy activities that they would like to take on. So if we could do both of these, respond to your presentation, but also if you could inform us with some of your guidance on how to be effective advocates, if we get those questions, that'd be appreciated. So
Sure.
Any questions from any of you folks yet? Go ahead and raise
Don't
your
tell me I was totally convincing.
Yeah, I'm sold.
So who are the people that you've already gotten kind of buy-in from? I mean, you mentioned your board members and this and that. Politically, have you reached out to Ted Lieu, to you know, the other kind of players within our realm?
Well, the first step, of course, is to establish that the sponsor of the legislation, which would be the Air District,
Hmm.
that they're receptive to that direction. The board membership previously, well, we had a go at this in 2019, and the board then supported it. We have to make sure some of the board members who are newer also buy in. And so and I think our primary partners in that effort will be the building trades, because the building trades, you know, it's a funny thing to have watched, but while prior leaders might fight like hell to protect the existing fossil order, newer leaders are ready to fight harder even to help create a better future. Now that they're convinced that their members can find jobs making it happen. So we count them as a leading advocate. There are, you know, in the environmental community, there are issues to be resolved for some folk. In particular, I think with respect to electrolytic hydrogen, not all environmental groups are on board with that. And I think
Could you, Denny, could you give a little more of an explanation about
sure,
that particular thing?
most of the hydrogen produced today in the world and in our country and in our state is produced by reforming methane, natural gas. Now, not so very long ago, natural gas was seen as a environmental friendly gas because it had buses that operated on natural gas were much cleaner than buses operated on diesel. But in the last 20 years, the awareness that methane, natural gas, is a powerful climate forcer has grown much stronger. As a result, there are many people who, for good reason, are wary about anything that might enable the expansion of the methane industry, right? The natural gas industry. And because most hydrogen is produced by reforming methane, a lot of people get very wary. They want to be convinced and confident that what you're doing is not going to create a back end opportunity for methane, because we want the methane industry to go away, right? So there's going to need to be a lot of discussion about how we create the right safeguards to ensure that the only hydrogen produced through this measure is produced through electrolysis using electricity and water. It's not hard to create that assurance at an electrolysis site. The real big issue are the pipelines and how you make sure that there's no blending of hydrogen with the methane in the pipelines. Then you got to create discrete and separate pipelines so that you can be confident that the only hydrogen being carried is electrolytic rather than and no methane. A variation on that is that some of the methane in our and most of our current methane emissions are not in the fossil pipelines at all. They're in the landfills and the water treatment facilities and in dairies and in cows, for example.
Mhm.
So you know, it may be that some of that needs to be converted to hydrogen under very strict conditions, but better if it's just used, if we figure out how to reduce it altogether by reducing, you know, our organic waste in landfills, or that we can use it to generate electricity on site, for example, at our landfills. But somehow we have to get rid of that methane without creating any opportunities for fossil methane. And that's kind of the trick, both politically and in implementation.
Denny, I've
Hey,
got
Ferris.
a question. Hey, how you doing? Yeah, this
Right.
this is Ferris from SMC. So I wanted to find out, how is this measure different or similar, would work in conjunction with other measures that support, public transit? Like, I think, is it Measure M that was passed? And, is it, how is it different, or how would it work with those?
Right, so Measure R and Measure M are
R,
measures
yeah.
that they're measures that we at Move LA initiated and convened the coalition and passed back in 08 and 2016. This measure, some of the technologies and infrastructure created by it could contribute to the operations of the metro system. So, for example, if we were to invest and expand our renewable power system, that power can operate Metro's trains, right?
Mm-hmm.
If fuel cells can be used, for example, in buses, battery electric buses have a challenge because of their range limitations on the time it takes to charge them. Often, in order to operate successfully, the transit operators are finding that they have to own twice as many buses, which is obviously very expensive.
Right.
But fuel cells operating on, clean hydrogen does not have that limitation. So by creating a electrolytic hydrogen economy, we can operate a lot of transit on hydrogen. Of course, the Metrolink system, which we'd like to invest in as well, is a 5-county system, not LA Metro, not an LA County system. It goes through LA County, but it's a different agency, and it goes much further, all throughout the 5 counties, 500-mile system. So that, and Metro is on their board, and Metro would certainly like to have that built in a way that is synced up to its transit system. And this resources would create that opportunity.
Great, that makes sense. And I've got a follow-up suggestion, maybe it is, where I would love to see some of the money raised used to work with Hollywood, because that's where the entertainment industry for America is based, basically, and it creates the messaging, all of the films and TV shows and commercials that the whole country sees, and has such an opportunity to change the way people think about moving themselves. And so, most scenes are shot in a car, right? Whenever you are watching some TV show or movie, most people are in a car, and that just reinforces the idea that that's how people get around, and that taking the bus or riding a bike or even driving an electric car is not normal. But so there's a lot of power there to work with Hollywood to do kind of product placement to normalize some of these new technologies. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, well, I've met with Jane Fonda a couple of times, and she's very interested in this. She, like other environmentalists, want to be confident that any such measure does not enable fossil fuels, continued fossil fuel reliance in any way. And so I expect her to be supportive, but we have to do our, these measures end up being a negotiation between the key constituencies. And so when we get to that point, I hope that Jane will be on board and mobilizing Hollywood with her. But I can't, it's not done yet.
Right. Well, I'll remind you. So thanks for doing all this, Denny. This is great.
Okay, we have another question from Barbara. Are you looking at the chat, Denny, or I can just read it?
Go ahead and read it.
Yeah. A big part of improving the environment is to raise money to pay for changing how we as a society travel. That means that there is politics involved, and in designing ballot measures, how to convince the public to spend their money for improved air, water, climate. Seems like you have to apprentice yourself to organizations working in this field. I think she's speaking as an advocate here. How else can young people make a difference and engage in this advocacy world?
Well, when we get to the right point in our work here, where we've got what we think are the key coalition partners, and we need support in the legislature, at the Air District Board, etc., we will call you.
Okay.
We will say, let your voice be heard. And the good news, of course, is that a lot of these agencies now allow people to testify virtually, so you don't have to go all the way to Diamond Bar.
Mhm.
Although it is fun.
Yeah.
You
How
got a
did,
giant auditorium, it's like,
yeah, yep. It's way out there in the Inland Empire.
yeah, and oddly, there's very little good transit access there as well. So
Mhm. So
that's got to be remedied.
Crystal has a question as well. And okay, her advocacy action, the interest she has right now is about sustainable furniture. One of my big reasons is about the transportation and how we should consider the environmental impact of shipping furniture over long distances. Will this affect the different vehicles that ship different items from long distances, such as furniture, since this is also constantly a way of transportation, a way that transportation hurting our environment?
Absolutely. I mean, the system that moves furniture and the resources that are used to make it, we broadly call it the goods movement system. And the goods movement system fundamentally is a diesel powered system. Although in the case of shipping, there's even some, fuels that are more ugly than diesel that are in use. And so in the case of the land part of that system, the trucking and the rail system, the rail freight system, those systems could all be powered by fuel cells and operate as well or better than they do on diesel. But they need to have the hydrogen fuel system available. And that's what this measure would seek to do. It would be to fund the investments needed, both the renewable power to produce the hydrogen and the electrolytic systems that create the hydrogen, and then the pipelines and trucking that would distribute the hydrogen. Those all need to be zero emission, and this measure would fund and enable those to become zero emission. The shipping itself probably is most likely to use ammonia, which is a hydrogen carrier, but can be used to operate fuel cells as well.
Interesting.
Imagine that we had all these trucks and ships on the road and you couldn't hear them. The experience we've had with EV, electric vehicles, battery powered cars on the road, where they have to create this manufactured spacey sounding sound in order to make sure that pedestrians know they're there. Imagine that we were no longer had to have the roar of buses and trucks, but that, like the cars, they were suddenly like super quiet. That would be cool. That's what this is about. Because in addition to clean air and climate health, we also get a quiet community.
Okay, thank you. Mario has a question. What share of the tax money this measure is expected to raise will go towards electric vehicle infrastructure versus public transportation and rail infrastructure? Which one has the most potential for battling air pollution and climate change in the region?
Well, I can't answer it yet because that would be in part of what one would expect a negotiation process to engage, but also a technical analytic process. How much is needed? And so there are studies that have been done and are being done to get a handle on how much EV charging and where will we need to be zero emission by, let's say, 2035 rather than 2045. That's just barely 10 years from now, right? So one can't say now with confidence, but we will be able to say with confidence before this goes to the ballot what the answer to that question is.
Okay, another question here regarding trash trucks. And let's assume this is about local trash trucks. Is it feasible to make them quiet now? And maybe you could address which technologies are available already. I don't think we have a hydrogen infrastructure to speak of yet in Santa Monica. Are there other, well, like electric trash trucks available?
Well, there are there are two parts of the noise there. One, of course, is the vehicle movement itself, and the other is that lifting motion that it makes with its arm, right? And I'm not absolutely certain how that's powered, but I assume that all of that could be powered with battery electric or fuel cell technologies, in which case you'd see a dramatic reduction in noise.
That would be welcome.
Well, in the apartment building where I live, I have a window to some of that activity.
Yeah, me too. Well, I have a question to bring it a little closer back to home here. We regularly have measures within the city of Santa Monica that we want to support, and they will come before Planning Commission or City Council. And, we have the opportunity to write emails or show up in person. And I wonder if you could just give us your take on, what's the most effective way to convey your feelings about a measure that you want to see passed or not passed, either one of those two. And if it's the latter, or in either case, what's the most effective way to make a compelling argument that would get the attention of the people sitting up on the dais there? Because, we've all seen lots of people speak, and sometimes they ramble on and eventually get around to making their point, or the bell goes off and they don't. So if you have anything, any tips or advice based on your experience on the other side of the dais there, what would they be?
Well, first of all, I would say that the driver of politics is coalitions. So if you want to be a successful advocate to the elected officials, build a coalition first. And especially if you can attract participation from multiple constituencies, different constituencies in that coalition. So for example, when I was first, Catherine knows and Ken knows, I was, working multi-local politics. renters' rights, affordable housing, city council races, what have you. I did a lot of, campaign work, organizing the direct mail campaigns and blah, blah, blah. But when I had to think now about how do I go create, convince LA Metro, the transportation agency, to put something on the ballot, I had to start convening partners from the business community, the labor community, as well as the environmental community, principally. And it was the combination of those voices speaking together that was really convincing to Mayor Villaraigosa and the other board members. And so that means, for most of you who don't yet know those people, maybe you might need to suck it up and introduce yourself. And that's what I did. I went out and knocked on the doors of labor leaders who had never heard of me before because they didn't care about Santa Monica. That was a little town on the coast. But hey, they'd give me an ear. And, generally speaking, I was prepared. And because I was prepared, it impressed them, and they give me a second meeting, or they send one of their staff to a coalition type meeting. So, there is no substitute for coalitions, and in coalition buildings, there's no substitute for meeting and no substitute for making an introduction, and no substitute for being prepared.
So speaking directly to those people is a great way, it sounds like.
Absolutely. It's like, and then it was a very funny thing. It happened early on as like, I was trying to get the business community leadership and the labor leadership to join together with environmental leadership to urge Metro to do this. And so I called a meeting, or asked for a meeting to be held at the Chamber of Commerce in downtown LA, where I was going to bring labor leaders. And as we were walking in the door of this building, I'm listening to these labor leaders I brought with me, and they're saying, "We've never been here before."
Wow.
And I was like, really? The labor movement in Los Angeles has never been in the building of the Chamber of Commerce? I'm stunned. A month later, we had a similar meeting at the LA County Federation of Labor's little funky little building over on James Wood Boulevard, and invited the key committee leaders from the Chamber of Commerce to come. And when they got there, they said, "We've never been here either." The two biggest, most powerful constituencies in LA, they might have seen each other, I suppose, at meetings and so on, but they had never been in each other's offices. And that was, I think, a breakthrough moment in getting Measure R going. And of course, one of the things that Measure R did, because it won, it gave us a lot of credibility. And when we would call then other labor leaders or newer labor leaders, they would answer our call and call us back or have them take a meeting with us. The same is true with elected officials, is that we were the gang that did Measure R. And believe me, when Measure M also passed, it was like, holy cow, where do these guys come from? Then, when I wanted to meet with Ridley Thomas to talk about what became Measure H, no problem. So it's like success breeds opportunity. And that's one of the reasons why this ballot measure at the Air District, I think, is a real possibility, is because most of the constituencies that we have to convene to make this work, we've already convened in a successful campaign before. They know us, they know that we can be effective and that we're not off the wall.
Mhm, mhm. Well, that's some great advice and with some exciting potential, I think. Just a little closer to home, I wonder if you could translate that, any of that to your experience in the formation and influence of Santa Monica's for Renters' Rights and how it initially got off the ground and became so influential.
Well, yeah, I mean, SMER, I mean, the way that all happened, it was right after Tom Hayden. Does anybody, people know, ever heard of the name Tom Hayden? Some of our older people have. And Tom Hayden and his wife, Jane Fonda, that everybody's heard of, were probably the most important anti-war leaders in the 60s and 70s against the war in Vietnam. And Tom ran for the Senate in California, and he had his office here in Santa Monica, at 2nd and Santa Monica Boulevard. And I got involved, and after that campaign was over, we had a little organization called CED, Campaign for Economic Democracy. And that was a group of people with a lot now of campaign experience. There was this other group in town of mostly older people, mostly women. And they're the ones who started the signature drive for the rent control ballot measure. And they came to us and asked us for help. And me and a buddy, Park Skelton, Catherine, you know Park, invited, Ken, you may know Park as well. We agreed to be, Park and I agreed to be the coordinators of the effort. Little did I know my life would be transformed by agreeing to do that. And we lost the first election in June of '78, but I successfully argued to Park and the others that we should try it again, that things were only going to get better because rents were still going to go up, because Howard Jarvis was going to say crazy stuff, because we would know better how to raise money, and we would do more direct mail and blah, blah, blah. And the second time we won. And that time was when we created SMER. And SMER at that time was a coalition of the original Committee for Fair Rents with all the older folks, and Santa Monica Democratic Club, and CED, and something called the Santa Monica Fair Housing Alliance. And that coalition, you know, that's what convinced me early on, is that successful political organizing of the sort I want to do, you know, progressive advocacy, environmental advocacy, requires coalitions. And you got to call a meeting. You got to knock on a door. You got to make a phone call. You got to figure out who, maybe get some advice about that. But this is not a spectator sport.
Yeah, that's for sure. Okay, well, we're past our formal end time. Nancy, I hope you kept it rolling through that. That was great advice. Oh, good. I see it is.
Yes,
Good.
it is.
All right. Any further questions for Denny? I mean, we got an opportunity here.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this measure because of the understanding that we've developed that we no longer have a mystery about how to get it done, how to beat climate change. We now know that if we invest in the infrastructure, we can do it. And that's exciting.
Indeed. Well, I'm excited about hearing the evolution of the initiative as it gets to the next steps and where we can begin to play a role as individuals. And looking forward to the coalition you're going to pull together and how that goes.
Exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Then I can retire. I'll be 77 this year. So when this goes to the ballot, I'll be, you know, just past 79.
Well, you're doing great work. Thank you for everything you've been doing over the decades, Denny. It's so appreciated, and we're seeing the effects of it being realized every year with the revenue that's being generated in every year.
So, you read in the paper maybe 2 weeks ago, there were the reports about how in LA County and LA City, for the first time, there was a reduction in the homeless counts.
Yes.
That was Measure H
Mm-hmm.
and Karen Bass. But, politicians, they don't get anything done with proclamations. They have to have resources. And so the county and the city all had Measure H.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you all have an opportunity this November to vote for Measure A countywide that will allow us to accelerate the reduction of homelessness.
Can you say anything more about A?
Well, it's really an increase of 1/4 cent on the sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
The total revenue will be 1.2 billion a year in perpetuity. In the first decade, about 25% will be used for affordable housing because more than half the money has to be used to prevent homelessness by either, for example, if somebody loses their job and they can't pay the rent, we got to come in and help them pay the rent until they find a job, right? If people are fighting unjust evictions, they need support. They need legal support. And when you look out here on our streets to see all the homeless people who are here, I will bet 90% of the time what you're seeing is an evictee. Someone who once had a place and was evicted and couldn't afford a new place. So we got to find a way to make it possible for them to stay in their place. That's the best thing, stay in their place. And that's what these measures do mostly, is they help people stay in their place.
Great. Well, on that note, I guess we should wrap up here, and
Thank you, guys.